You got to get up right now. Turn the system upside down. You're supposed to be fed up by now. Turn the system upside down. Get up.
Hello, this is Speak Out Socialists, a podcast produced by Speak Out Now. We are a revolutionary socialist group. Our website is speakoutsocialist.org. You can find us on Facebook at Speak Out Now or on Instagram and Twitter at RevSocialists.
These are the reports from the weeks of July 1st through July 15th. Maquilas and coronavirus. Mexican workers fight U.S. corporations and government for the right to live. The southern side of the U.S.-Mexico border is dotted with maquilas. Companies contracted with U.S. corporations to run factories employing workers at poverty wages in abysmal conditions to produce exports to the U.S. with special tax exemptions. 2.6 million people work there, about 5% of Mexico's entire workforce. The majority of maquila workers are women, who experience especially intense exploitation at these facilities. As the coronavirus pandemic spiraled out of control in March and April, Mexican federal and state governments began ordering the maquilas to close, determining that they were non-essential businesses. But many of the bosses defied the order. A coalition of multi-billion-dollar U.S. corporations came together, including 3M Corporation, ArcelorMittal, and Caterpillar, to pressure the Mexican federal government to keep the plants open. By mid-April, the U.S. government was weighing in. COVID was already claiming the lives of maquila workers, including at least 16 workers at a single car seat plant in Ciudad Juarez. But the U.S. Embassy and the Department of Defense came in on the side of the bosses, increasing the pressure on Mexico to reopen the maquilas, out of concern for the profits of U.S. corporations, as well as the production line for U.S. military equipment manufactured in Mexico. On May 12th, Mexico's President López Obrador caved to the pressure and declared many of the maquilas essential, supposedly offering a plan to keep the factory safe. This despite the fact that COVID had already killed over 100 maquila workers in Juarez and over 400 in Tijuana. With the maquilas officially allowed to stay open, the numbers kept climbing, rising to 200 in Juarez and over 600 in Tijuana by June. The maquila capital of Mexico, Juarez, has the highest rate of COVID deaths in Mexico, 2.5 times the national average. Workers are being forced back into the maquilas without sanitary protections. Those who refuse are fired on the spot, in blatant violation of local labor laws. But unlike their president, Mexican workers are not taking this lying down. Under slogans like Stop Maquilas and The Virus is the Maquila, maquila workers have been leading protests to raise awareness around the dangers of the plants, resist these terminations, and demand paid leave. Workers and activists are risking their lives and face serious oppression. On June 8th, Tamaulipas State Police arrested Susana Prieto, a labor attorney, for defending maquila workers and speaking out against the government's policy. She was charged with inciting violence. Meanwhile, the bosses and police were forcing workers to die in the name of profit. Prieto spent 23 days in prison and must now spend the next 30 months under house arrest. As of July 12th, COVID-19 had claimed the lives of over 35,000 people in Mexico, and a disproportionate number of these have been maquila workers. These workers are fighting for their lives against their bosses, local governments, the Mexican government, as well as the U.S. government and the U.S. corporations who profit off their labor, the same ones that oppress and exploit us here in the U.S. The Mexican workers should not have to do it alone. The fight will always have to continue until the working class of all countries rises in solidarity to overthrow the capitalist system once and for all. The future is not certain, but one thing that is certain is that as the working class we can only count on ourselves to defend our lives. It's up to workers here and everywhere to stand in solidarity with maquila workers. Millions deprived of health coverage when we need it most. 5.4 million people lost health insurance coverage in the U.S. during the pandemic between February and May. While a deadly virus spreads across the world, claiming over 138,000 lives and infecting almost 3.5 million people in the U.S. alone, instead of expanding access to healthcare, millions in the U.S. have lost it. Experts say they expected this to happen. While the virus has taken a toll on people's health, the response to it has left millions jobless, caused many businesses to collapse, and halted whole sectors of the global economy, bringing the world into the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. In past economic collapses, as with this one, people have lost their health insurance as they lost their jobs, incomes, and support systems. But this downturn, in the middle of a pandemic, has seen one of the worst collapses of the number of insured, 40% more than the last crash in 2008, when 3.9 million adults in the U.S. lost health insurance. What could more clearly expose the failure of the economic and political system we live under? Stripping people of their homes, livelihoods, and now health insurance in the midst of a deadly pandemic is nonsensical and horrifying. We need a society that prioritizes human health over profit. We need it yesterday, and it's up to us to build a movement to get it. Energy Secretary credits activists for shutting down pipelines. July 12th. It was recently announced that the Dakota Access Pipeline, the largest oil pipeline out of North Dakota, will be shut down, as well as the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Part of the Dakota Access Pipeline ran through Lake Oahe, a drinking water source for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, which fought against its construction along with thousands of supporters. The United States Energy Secretary puts the blame on activists for shutting down and emptying these destructive and polluting oil pipelines. This just shows the power that we have when we work collectively for what our communities need. Successes like this reinforce that we can change the course of our future. But history also tells us that the fight is not over after one struggle is won. So long as the capitalist system remains, indigenous communities will continue to be robbed and attacked, and the environment will continue to be destroyed. There will be many more struggles to come. We must organize and get ready for the attacks we know will follow, and build for a future society that doesn't exploit the earth or the people on it. Trump administration on the pandemic. People will get over it. July 10th. A recent Washington Post article summarized the Trump administration's approach to the pandemic according to officials linked to the administration. These officials told the Washington Post that the administration is, quote, of the belief that people will get over it, or if we stop highlighting it, the public will learn to accept 50,000 to 100,000 new cases a day, unquote, and just, quote, live with the virus being a threat, unquote. The actions of the Trump administration in response to the pandemic have certainly demonstrated that this has been their policy all along. But it is still shocking to have this callous attitude admitted openly. So far, there have been over 130,000 deaths from this virus in the U.S. As of July 6th, COVID-19 is the fifth greatest cause of death in the U.S., following heart disease, cancer, accidents, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and strokes, in that order. And several states are seeing new spikes in cases and hospitalizations. We are not even close to the end of this nightmare. With this virus taking the lives of our family members, our friends, our coworkers, and our neighbors, we cannot just get over it. The Trump administration, along with all of the so-called leaders of this country, continue to make it clear by the day that what matters in this country is only the profits of corporations, not the lives of working people. Supreme Court fast-tracks oil and gas pipelines. Our power to stop them is through mobilizing. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of oil and gas companies last Monday when they approved fast-track permitting for pipeline construction across the U.S. This was in reaction to a ban on fast-track permitting for pipelines that cross water bodies that was issued by a lower court in Montana. The Supreme Court ruled that this ban on crossing water bodies will only apply to the well-known Keystone XL pipeline. Other pipelines, like the Mountie Valley Pipeline in West Virginia, now can be more easily permitted to cross under nearly 1,000 rivers and wetlands. Environmental groups that have fought against the Keystone XL pipeline are right to celebrate that this pipeline will be further delayed. At the same time, the overall ruling was applauded by the American Petroleum Institute and called a, quote, significant step towards restoring more certainty for energy companies, unquote. The government makes a big show of putting their finger in the dam to block oil production, but this is a distraction from the floodgates they keep opening further for oil and gas. Even as the U.S. Supreme Court delayed construction in the U.S. for the Keystone XL pipeline, the construction in Canada has continued completely uninterrupted, and with the help of $5.3 billion in financial aid from the Canadian government. Activists in the environmental movement must draw an honest balance sheet. The fight against global climate disruption is not being won in court or through legislation. We have won some serious victories because of our pressure in the streets, blocking industry's plans aggressively on the ground. 2020 is on track to be the hottest year ever recorded, with record-breaking temperatures and fires in Siberia, which will dump further greenhouse gases into the environment. Delaying individual pipelines, just like changing individual lifestyles, will do nothing in the face of the climate disruption we are facing. While we stall the fossil fuel industry here and there, in order to begin to face the climate crisis seriously, it will take at minimum a revolution that places the power in the hands of working and oppressed people. The mass movements of working people leading to a revolution will create alternative decision-making organizations for society that will be completely outside of the control of any industry. This new democracy of the 99% will allow us to pour all of our resources, scientific knowledge, and efforts into transforming the world, not only to end fossil fuel dependence, but also to begin to slow the feedback loops that threaten our entire species and life on this planet. Brazil's president tests positive for COVID. The president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, has just tested positive for COVID-19. Like most politicians, Bolsonaro has supported profit-making over saving lives. And like Trump, he has also opposed any lockdowns and other necessary measures to reduce the spread of the virus because it would be bad for business. Even the drug gangs in Brazil's capital have taken the pandemic more seriously than this president. In Brazil, the coronavirus, which Bolsonaro calls a little flu, has killed 67,000 people, and the virus is still surging. There were 48,000 new cases reported on July 9th. This puts Brazil in second place worldwide for deaths by coronavirus. Donald Trump can be proud that the US is still number one. In March, when asked whether Brazil's outbreak could get as bad as the US, Bolsonaro answered, quote, "I don't think it will reach that point, especially because Brazilians have to be studied. They don't get anything. You see the guy jumping into the sewer there, going out, diving, right? And nothing happens to him." Unquote. Tell that to the families of the 67,000 people who have died from this so-called little flu. Bolsonaro and Trump aren't unique. They just express more openly the contempt that those in the ruling class have for ordinary working people. The fact that now, after months of willful neglect, Bolsonaro too has contracted this virus is just a tiny consolation for all of the misery that working people have had to face from this pandemic. Students organize in solidarity as ICE announces it will deport students in online classes. On July 6th, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, announced that for the next school semester, they will deport any immigrant on a student visa in the United States who was enrolled only in online classes. This will put hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. at risk of deportation just because their school is protecting public health. It's a heartless political ploy by Trump and his xenophobic cronies to force universities to either reopen more quickly or make the immigrant students leave. While this new deportation policy is a cruel attack, the response has been inspiring. Students across the country have stood in solidarity with international students. At UC Berkeley, some students organized a student-facilitated class that will meet in person with social distancing so that immigrants on student visas can meet the requirements to have at least one class in person. Other universities in the UC system and across the country have followed suit, offering in-person classes specifically to immigrants on student visas. And Harvard University and MIT sued the Trump administration to reverse the policy. This exhilarating reaction by students across the country is an example for us to follow and build upon. For decades, immigrants have been used as sources of cheap labor from which corporations and businesses take a greater profit, or as pawns and scapegoats in the racist and xenophobic games of politicians and CEOs. We need to organize ourselves and fight together to protect all immigrants from detention and deportation. South Pole warming 3 times faster than the rest of the Earth. July 7th. The South Pole is warming at a rate 3 times faster than the rest of the globe. According to a recent analysis of more than 60 years of weather station data, Warmer ocean temperatures in the tropical western Pacific have increased warm air currents directly over the South Pole, warming it by more than 3.3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1989. These warmer waters thousands of miles away are causing a change in atmospheric pressure, pushing warm air over this region. Researchers believe global warming has played a role by affecting air circulation patterns, though they're uncertain by how much. The most worrisome trend in Antarctica is its coastline, which is in imminent danger. Seaside glaciers are melting away from the bottom up, as warmer ocean waters seep into the ice. So while scientists are unclear of how much the warming of the South Pole is due to tropical weather cycles and how much can be attributed to climate change, they are confident about the role of human activity on these melting glaciers, and that these melting glaciers are causing potentially catastrophic global sea level rise. While we can't control all weather patterns, this fact just reinforces that we must focus on doing what we can. Stopping glacier melt requires lowering ocean temperatures, which means stopping greenhouse gas emissions. The future of this planet depends on what we do now. Walkout at Whole Foods, Standing Up for Black Lives, July 5th. Workers at a Whole Foods in Cambridge, Massachusetts, staged a walkout on July 1st to protest management's decision to not allow employees to wear masks supporting Black Lives Matter. Earlier in the week, the boss had sent home workers who had been wearing masks with the slogan, provoking outrage amongst the store's workers. They organized themselves for the walkout. As one of the workers said in a speech, quote, "Silencing our support for Black lives is silencing the customers and communities we hold dear," unquote. Whole Foods and Amazon, the company that owns Whole Foods, have previously come out in quote-unquote support for Black Lives Matter. The banner on the front page of the Whole Foods website reads, "Racism has no place here," and a quick search on Amazon for Black Lives Matter reveals that, quote, "Amazon stands in solidarity with the black community," unquote. Like thousands of other corporations and businesses, Amazon and Whole Foods pretend to care about social issues, but only so that they can market themselves better and make a buck. There certainly wasn't any wave of corporate support for Black Lives Matter in 2014 after the murder of Michael Brown, or in 2015 after the murders of Freddie Gray and Eric Garner. Not as many people were as activated and engaged then, so there was much less marketing potential for corporations to exploit. This silencing of workers at Whole Foods is just another example of how thin corporate commitment to ending racism actually is. Corporations cannot and will not end 400 years of institutionalized racism in this country. Instead, we should look to the workers at Whole Foods who organized themselves to fight against racism. We all need to organize ourselves and fight. San Francisco General Strike, 86 years ago. The power of worker solidarity. 86 years ago, longshore workers all along the Pacific coast were on strike. The strike began in May 1934, during the Great Depression. At the time, the conditions that existed were brutal. Every day, workers showed up at the so-called slave market, where crew managers would pick their crews for the day. There was no consistent work or pay, shifts were long, dangerous, and hiring practices were discriminatory. Longshore workers were demanding union control of their hiring hall, a coast-wide contract with the same wages and protections, and a 6-hour workday. In San Francisco on July 5th, the Employers Association tried to forcefully open the port. They called in the police and National Guard to open the port using guns and tear gas, injuring and arresting hundreds of strikers and bystanders. This day became known as Bloody Thursday after 2 workers, one a longshoreman, the other a Communist Party organizer and unemployed cook, were killed. In reaction, tens of thousands of workers all over the city stood in solidarity, first in a funeral march, and later, workers walked out in a general strike that lasted for 4 days and brought the whole city to a standstill. The strike came to an end when conservative union leaders called it off, and the longshoremen's fight ended in arbitration. But for the first time in the history of the waterfront, workers had won control of their own union halls. The 1934 strike was also the first time black workers were allowed into the longshoremen's union. Historically, the leadership of the union had a racist policy, excluding black workers. Because of the anti-racist leadership of Harry Bridges and other revolutionaries on the waterfront, the longshoremen reached out to the black community and promised that black workers would always have a place on the waterfront. This strike was the first Longshore Strike in San Francisco in which black workers joined in, helping the strike rather than taking jobs as strikebreakers. Black workers became integrated into the longshoremen's union, and because of worker control over their union hall, longshoremen could guarantee that their black co-workers would have stable hours and jobs. Bloody Thursday and the West Coast Maritime Strike was a struggle. Workers were on the defensive and under attack. The strength of the strike came from the efforts workers took to reach out to others and expand their forces. The San Francisco General Strike is a testament to the strength of working-class solidarity, which allowed the strike to win against all odds. The 4th of July. Independence for whom? On July 4, 1776, 13 colonies on the continent of North America declared themselves to be independent from Britain, after a year-long conflict against British soldiers. The American Revolution, the struggle for national independence, lasted for 7 more years. This struggle was in response to years of taxes imposed on the American colonists, due to Britain's rising military debts from its imperialist plunder in India and Canada. The colonists also revolted against Britain's strict control over the colonists' access to markets, credit, and trade. The Americans had had enough of the British ruling class siphoning off and impeding the growth of their wealth. They were also sick of being a colony ruled over by a foreign power with no political rights. American colonists resisted British rule by boycotting and rioting, confronting customs men and soldiers, and burning down tax and other government offices. The core of the resistance was supplied by small traders and landowners, but common people also joined the fight with the goal of gaining their own rights and liberties. The rich wanted the freedom to make greater profits on their own terms. The working masses opposed the foreign occupation of their country. And it was ordinary people that did the bulk of fighting and dying for the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the Constitution that resulted from the American Revolution protected the rule of property, including the enslavement of the black population. It defended free markets rather than free people. The new country was governed by a ruling elite of landowners, merchants, and bankers. With the end of British rule and the reduction of the political domination of the southern plantation owners, the American capitalists were able to pave the way for capitalism to develop. They were able to enrich themselves within the confines of their own independent nation-state. The American Revolution in 1776 won independence from the imperialist power of the day. Later, the American Civil War of the 1860s ended the system of chattel slavery. It opened up the country for unobstructed industrial development on the backs of the working class, using racism to try to keep the working class divided. The task of our next revolution will be to take society out of the hands of the 1% and put it in the hands of the majority. That will be the true American Revolution deserving of a celebration. Bringing down the statues that glorify racism. July 3rd. Following the wave of mass protests against racial injustice sparked by the killing of George Floyd, people across the country are focusing their anger on tearing down and demanding the removal of statues, monuments, flags, and other symbols of the former Confederacy. These are representations of white supremacy and serve as constant reminders of the violence and oppression that millions of people, especially Black and American Indian people, have experienced for centuries at the hands of the rich and powerful. Their withdrawal from public spaces is long overdue, and finally many have decided to take matters into their own hands. For decades there has been an outcry against these Confederate symbols, and a push to take them down, but those in power have refused to act. This time, though, facing enormous pressure from the mass mobilization, politicians and corporations have been forced to respond. In Mississippi, the governor swiftly signed a bill to have the Confederate emblem removed from the state's flag. In Birmingham, Alabama, the city mayor preferred to get the city sued over the removal of a Confederate monument than to risk more protests. NASCAR banned the use of Confederate flags at all its races and events when its only full-time black driver, Bubba Wallace, spoke out. The removal of Confederate icons came with an immediate backlash. Opponents claim that removing the statues is equivalent to erasing American history and cultural identity. Some have accused the protesters of being Marxist extremists who want to destroy the government. Trump went so far as to sign an executive order directing federal authorities to arrest and prosecute people who removed or damaged federal monuments with up to 10 years in prison. But people are right in demanding the elimination of all symbols of racism, slavery, colonialism, and other forms of oppression. They serve no purpose other than to glorify these racists, ignoring their inhumanity. But we also need to go deeper. Toppling a monument or changing a flag will not end the systemic racism, violence, inequality, and exploitation that thrives under capitalism. Tackling these problems requires a complete transformation of the system we live under. What these mass actions and protests have shown us, however, is that we have the power to do so. It's a matter of continuing to mobilize and organize our own forces to make it happen.
Speak Out Now is a revolutionary socialist organization. Our website is speakoutsocialists.org. You can find us on Facebook at Speak Out Now or on Instagram and Twitter at Rev Socialists. We want to thank Boots Riley and the Coup for letting us use their song Get Up featuring Dead Prez. Thanks for listening.